Hello everyone. Today I'm going to introduce you about stakeholder management in digital analysis and forecasting for agricultural development. But before going to discuss about stakeholder management, there will always be a question. So what is stakeholder management then? And who is going to manage stakeholder? So this is the definition that I adapted from the two other sources, in which stakeholder management is the process of systematic identification, analysis, planning, engaging, and all other kinds of activities in terms of managing stakeholders. And with that, there would be also another question. So who is going to manage stakeholders? So traditionally, stakeholder management has been done quite a lot in private sector, in which private sector would like to influence the other stakeholders that can bring the benefit for the business. But after that, the stakeholder management approach have been used in policy advocacy, in which organizations such as NGO, for example, or also international organization would advocate for the stakeholder engagement so that the voice of the most vulnerable can also be heard by other stakeholders. Why do we need to do stakeholder management in digital analysis? Let's look at this picture. In reality, it's not rare that decisions are made in a closed door with limited involvement of other stakeholders. And as a consequence, other stakeholders might be negatively affected by the decisions. In this slide, I'm going to introduce you about stakeholder management process, which consists of 4 steps, including stakeholder identification, stakeholder categorization and analysis. And with the stakeholder categorization, we can also use to identify experts, or we can also use to analyze the interests and empower of the different stakeholders. And with that, it can be used for stakeholder planning and stakeholder engagement. However, for the topic of today, I'm going to focus on the first 2 topics only. So the step 1 is stakeholder identification. And in order to identify stakeholder, we need to first know what is a definition of stakeholder. And I'm going to introduce you 3 definitions. And the first one defines that stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of the organization's objectives. And so in this definition, group, individual, affect, or affected are those the keywords. And the second definition saying that stakeholder can be any naturally occurring entity that is affected by organizational performance. And entity in this case means both human and non-human entity, meaning that forests or animals, which are non-human entity, could also be considered as stakeholders. And the third definition saying that stakeholder is any individual or group who has an interest in the project or is implemented by the project. So we can see that there's a new aspect here saying that people who has an interest could also be considered as stakeholders. And so there's no right or wrong definition. We just need to choose. So it's a matter of choice to say that which definition might be appropriate for our study, or if we need to consider the different aspect of the different definition to use for our study. And so in my study, I based on 2 previous definitions of stakeholders and define that stakeholder is any individual or group who has an interest in a a decision and or who can affect or is affected by a decision. To be honest, at the time I didn't know that non-human entity could be a stakeholder. And recently in my group, there was one person who suggested that we could actually include non-human entity as stakeholder by having people who can represent them as a stakeholders. It's quite interesting, but actually that wasn't what I thought at the beginning. And so with the definition that I have developed for my study, then I could consider stakeholder could be male or females or other genders. It could be senior, junior, individual or group, and so on. But what if there are too many stakeholders? What could we do then? Can we analyze every stakeholders? That seems to be too much. And one of the solution is that we can develop criteria to define which stakeholder we are going to analyze. And of course, we can develop the criteria with the argument. For example, like you could say that you may not be able to focus in international stakeholders because you don't have resources to do that, and that in your study you may mainly focus on national and local stakeholder. After defining stakeholder, we can use the different methods to identify the stakeholders. The first method could be focus group discussion. And with that, you can use the tool and techniques to identify. For example, we can use the brainstorming techniques, which is a technique that we can have a group of people thinking and discussing about who could be potential stakeholder. And then we write down on sticky note, and then after that we compile it. Or we can use mind mapping technique. Another method is to use a semi-structured interview with a list of questionnaire in which we may ask a question such as who is affected by the decision, or who is affecting the decision, or who may have interest in the decision. And another method is a desk review, where we base on the previous study, or we can use organizational charts, or we can use the stakeholder report in which there would be a lot of information about stakeholders. Or we can also use an advocacy plan, which normally they would also list out the relevant stakeholders. Or we can also use a value chain report, particularly in agriculture, where they would often list out who are the stakeholders in the value chains. Another technique, another method is a snowball sampling. It is the way that we can meet with one stakeholder and ask if they can recommend other stakeholders. And the next method is expert opinion. It has quite a lot of similarity with the semi-structured interview method, but in this case, you may focus on specific people, for example, like the stakeholder expert. Let's take one example. If you want to know about stakeholder in agroforestry, you may just need to meet someone who is expert in agroforestry stakeholder, and you can get a lot of information from that person. Another method is a self-reflection, where we can have an announcement and stakeholder can nominate themselves as a stakeholder. And of course, we can also combine different methods and techniques in identifying stakeholder. The next step after identifying stakeholder is categorization and analysis. And there are two methods to categorize stakeholder. One is quite top-down way, in the way that there is a group of people who would use a different attribution and categorize stakeholders. Another approach is the bottom-up approach, where stakeholders themselves can categorize them based on the different attributions. And but with both approach, we could have like different analysis of the stakeholder. One example could be experience availability expertise analysis of stakeholder, and that could help to inform identifying experts. Another product of analysis stakeholder is to have the interest and influence metric, which is very common metric and could be used to engage stakeholders. Here I present my case study with focus on agro-climate information value chain. And with the value chain approach, I map out different components in the value chains. And from that, I would map out the stakeholder as a national and local levels. And the way I map out is to use a case study and also to have the interview with the local organizations who have understanding about the value chains. So it means that for the techniques we use in identification of stakeholder, we can combine the different techniques. After identifying stakeholders, I could categorize them to identify potential experts. Here is the list of stakeholders, and with the various attributions of the stakeholders, including like their position, gender, their role, expertise, experience, and availability. It is also possible to do a further step by using R and visualizing the stakeholders using the different criteria or attribution. For example, I can categorize a stakeholder with high experience and availability as a potential core expert. And I can categorize people with high experience and limited availability as a resource person. And with this resource person, I can go and meet them directly to save time, or I can only invite them at specific time, but not that they would involve in the whole process. And with the attribution of expertise, there is the case that there might be different stakeholders have the same expertise. And in that case, I could use the criteria such as gender to identify the potential expert. For example, if there are too many, then it might be possible to see if it is gender balance in the expert team. And if not, then we could use that one to choose who could be the potential expert. But there is also another case that there might be some area of knowledge that we don't have expert here yet. And in that case, we can consider having an external expert. In my study, I use a stakeholder analysis for advocacy purpose. And here's a result that I did for 2019. And with this, I use the different attributions to categorize stakeholders, such as like interest, influence, relevance, attitude. And from that, I can categorize stakeholder in the different groups. And I repeated the activity in 2020 to see the dynamic of the stakeholder. And the results was interesting in the way that I can observe different or new attitude of stakeholders in 2020. And I could also realize the change of the stakeholder. For example, here's one stakeholder which completely changed the interest and influence in 2020 in compared to 2019. Or I could also realize new stakeholder. And that is the initial result in respect of stakeholder management in my study. And I also provide some question for answer and reflection at the end of the presentation. So feel free to check it out on the website. Thank you for your attention.